The galaxy was a cold and ancient place, and humanity was still very new to it. Most alien species had been traveling between the stars for thousands of years before humans even learned to make fire, and they never let humanity forget that fact. Among the oldest civilizations were two great empires, the Valith Dominion and the Sci-Fi Hegemony, and between their vast territories lay a strip of lawless space known as the Fringe, where pirates and smugglers and desperate people made their living in the dark between the stars. Commander Kale Draven was one of those desperate people. He was a human, a former Marine of the Earth Coalition, and he had fought in wars that left scars on both his body and his mind. Now he flew a beat-up gunship called the Iron Maw through the Fringe, picking through wreckage and salvaging whatever he could sell to keep fuel in his tanks. He was not a man who smiled often. He was not a man who talked much either. Simply survived, day after day, alone in the black. On that particular day, Kale had picked up a faint distress beacon coming from a debris field near the border of Valith space. His sensors showed the remains of several ships, elegant Valith escort cruisers torn apart by weapons fire. Whoever had hit them hard and fast. Kale guided the Iron Maw through the floating wreckage, scanning for anything worth taking. Fuel cells, power cores, navigation equipment, all of it had value on the Fringe. But as he moved deeper into the debris field, his scanners picked up something unexpected. A ship was still intact. It was not Valith, it was Sithari, a small corvette with dark angular plating and weapon ports still glowing faint red. The vessel was drifting without power, and Kale could see from his readings that its reactor was failing. It would not last much longer. He should have turned around, told him to leave it alone, collect what scrap he could from the Valith wrecks, and get out before anyone came looking. But the beacon was coming from inside that corvette, and Kale had never been very good at ignoring distress calls. He suited up, grabbed his sidearm, and docked with the dying ship. The inside of the Sithari corvette was a nightmare. Emergency lights cast everything in a dull red glow, and the air was thick with smoke and the sharp smell of burning metal. Kale moved through the corridors with his weapon raised, stepping over the bodies of Sithari soldiers. Some had been killed by the initial attack, thrown against walls, or crushed by collapsing supports. Others had wounds that told a different story. Internal fighting, maybe a failed mutiny, or a struggle with prisoners who had not gone quietly. He found the detention block near the center of the ship. Two containment cells sat side by side, their energy barriers still, flickering with the last of the ship's power. Inside the first cell stood a tall alien woman with silver skin and markings along her arms and face that gave off a faint blue light. She had sharp features and eyes that burned with fury and pride even through the barrier. Her clothes were torn, and there was a bruise across her jaw, but she stood straight as a blade, refusing to show weakness. In the second cell was another woman of the same species, smaller and younger, with softer features and wider eyes. Her bioluminescent markings were dimmer, flickering with what Kale would later learn was a sign of fear and exhaustion among the Valith. She had a cut on her arm that was still bleeding, and she watched Kale approach with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. Kale lowered his weapon slightly and looked at them both. "Who are you?" he asked. The tall one spoke first, and her voice was like a cold wind. "I am Princess Saleth of the Royal House of Vaelara, first daughter of the Valith Dominion, and you will address me with the respect my station demands, Terran." Kale stared at her for a long moment. "Okay," he said. He looked at the younger one. "And you?" "I am Alara," she said quietly, her sister. Kale took a slow breath and looked around at the dead Sithari soldiers and the failing ship and the two alien princesses locked in cages, and he understood that his simple salvage run had just become something far more complicated. "The ship is dying," he said plainly. The reactor is going to blow, and I give it maybe 20 minutes before this whole thing comes apart. I have a ship docked outside, and I can get you out of here." Saylet's eyes narrowed with contempt. "I would rather die and accept rescue from a human," she said. "Your kind are animals, violent primitive creatures who crawl through space like vermin. Contact the Valith Dominion and have them send a proper escort." Kale looked at her without expression. "Your escort is in pieces outside," he said, "and the Dominion is not coming. Not in 20 minutes, not before this ship tears itself apart. You can hate me all you want, but you can do it alive on my ship, or you can do it dead on this one." Saylet opened her mouth to argue, but Alara spoke from her cell. "Sister, please." Her voice was calm, but there was a tremor beneath it. "He is right. We cannot contact anyone from here, and the ship is failing. I do not want to die in a Sithari cage." Saylet looked at her younger sister, and something in her fierce expression cracked just slightly. It was not submission, it was love, the kind that overrides pride when the person you care about most is in danger. She turned back to Kale. "If you betray us, human, I will end you myself." "Fair enough," Kale said. He moved to the cell controls and worked quickly. Locks with a field tool from his belt. The barriers dropped, and the two princesses stepped out into the corridor. Saylet moved like a predator, alert and coiled, keeping herself between Kale and her sister at all times. Alara stayed close, one hand pressed against the wound on her arm. As they moved through the dying ship toward the Iron Maw's docking port, the corvette groaned and shuddered around them. Panels fell from the ceiling, and sparks erupted from broken conduits. Kale led the way, stepping over debris and bodies with the ease of a man who had walked through worse. At one point, a section of the corridor collapsed ahead of them, blocking the path. Kale did not hesitate. He grabbed a broken support beam with his bare hands and wrenched it aside, the metal screaming as it bent. Alara watched with wide eyes. Even Saylet seemed momentarily stunned by the raw physical strength the human displayed without any visible strain. They reached the docking port, and Kale ushered them through into the Iron Maw. The princesses looked around the ship with visible distaste. Where Valith vessels were smooth and elegant, built with living crystal and light, the Iron Maw was rough steel and exposed wiring and the smell of engine grease. It was a machine built for survival, not beauty. "Welcome aboard," Kale said flatly as he sealed the airlock and ran to the cockpit. He dropped into the pilot's seat and fired up the engines. Through the front viewport, they could see the Sithari corvette beginning to break apart. Cracks of white light splitting its hull as the reactor entered its final failure. Kale punched the thrusters, and the Iron Maw pulled away hard, the force pressing all three of them back as the ship roared to life. Behind them, the corvette exploded in a silent bloom of fire and light that lit up the debris field like a small sun. They were clear. Let out a breath and leaned back in his seat. His hands were steady on the controls, but his jaw was tight. He turned and looked at the two princesses standing in the doorway of his cockpit, the silver-skinned royalty of one of the oldest civilizations in the galaxy, bruised and bleeding, and standing on the dirty floor of a human salvage ship. He noticed the royal insignia on their torn garments, the crest of House Vaelara, which even a fringe rat like him recognized. These were not just any Valith. These were the daughters of the Emperor himself. Kale turned back to the viewport and stared out at the stars. "This is either the best payday of my life," he muttered to himself, "or the worst mistake I have ever made." Behind him, Saylet stood rigid with her arms crossed, already planning how to take control of the situation. Beside her, Alara looked at the back of the human's head, with an expression that was not quite gratitude and not quite curiosity, but something in between. The first quiet spark of a question she had carried her whole life. What if everything they had been told about humans was wrong? The Iron Maw flew on into the dark, carrying a warrior who wanted to be left alone, and two princesses who had never been more lost, and none of them knew yet just how far this road would take them. The Iron Maw was not built for guests. It was a ship designed for one person, one human who did not care about comfort or appearances, and every corner of it showed that truth clearly. The corridors were narrow and lined with pipes that hissed with steam. The lighting was harsh and yellow. The floor grating rattled with every step, and somewhere deep in the belly of the ship, an engine component made a rhythmic clanking sound that never seemed to stop. For Princess Salith and Princess Aelora of the Valith Dominion, it was like stepping into a cave. Valith ships were grown from living crystal, with walls that pulsed with soft bioluminescent light and air that smelled of flowers and clean water. The Iron Maw smelled of oil and metal and something Aelora quietly identified as old coffee. "This is where the human lives," Salith said with open disgust as she looked at the cramped quarters Kale had offered them. His own sleeping space. Only private room on the ship, with a narrow bunk and a small table bolted to the wall. "This is where I sleep, actually," Kale said from the doorway. "But it is yours for now. I will take the cargo bay." "You expect us to sleep in this?" Salith asked. "I expect you to be alive tomorrow," Kale answered. "The sleeping part is optional." He left them there and went to the cockpit, and Salith stood in the middle of the tiny room with her fists clenched, while Aelora sat on the bunk and tried to stop her arm from bleeding through the bandage Kale had wrapped around it before they left the Corvette. For the first several hours they did not see much of the human. He stayed in the cockpit, working the controls and running scans, and the sisters were left alone to process what had happened to them. Their royal transport had been ambushed, a Sithari strike force appearing from nowhere, overwhelming the escorts in minutes, and boarding the transport. Soldiers who moved with the cold precision of special operations. Salith had fought. She had been trained in combat since childhood, as all Valith royals were, and she had taken down 3 Sithari soldiers before they overwhelmed her. Aelora had not fought. She was a scholar, not a warrior, and she had been dragged to the containment cells while screaming her sister's name. Now they were on a human ship in the middle of lawless space, and everything they knew was very far away. When Kale finally came back, his face was grim. "I tried to contact the Valith Dominion," he said, standing in the doorway with his arms folded. "Every official channel is broadcasting the same message. The princesses of House Valara are dead, killed by human pirates, and the Dominion is preparing for war." Salith went very still. "That is a lie," she said. "I know that," Kale said. "You are standing right in front of me, but someone wanted it to be true, and they have done a very good job of making the whole galaxy believe it. The Sithari did not just kidnap you, they framed my species for it." Aelora looked up from the bunk with growing horror. "If humanity is blamed for our deaths, then both the Dominion and the Hegemony will turn against Earth." "That is the idea," Kale said, "and if I try to return you through official channels, I will be executed before I can say a single word. Every Valith patrol in this sector is hunting for human ships right now." Salith's eyes burned. "This is a Sithari plot. The Pale Hand, their intelligence branch, they have wanted war for decades, and now they have manufactured the perfect excuse. And my people get crushed in the middle," Kale said quietly. There was a silence between the three of them, the kind of silence that comes when everyone in the room understands just how bad things really are. Salith broke it. "Part of this?" she demanded, stepping toward Kale with accusation in her voice. "How do I know this is not exactly where they wanted us, on a human ship, under human control, ready to be used as leverage?" Kale looked at her steadily. "If I wanted to use you as leverage, Princess, I would not have given you my bed," he said. Salith did not back down, and over the next 2 days, she tested Kale constantly. She tried to access the ship's navigation systems, and he let her look, hiding nothing. She questioned every course change, and he explained each one patiently. She searched through his personal storage, not for weapons, but for evidence of conspiracy, and she found none. What she did find surprised her. In a battered metal locker in the cargo bay, she discovered a folded uniform, Earth Coalition Marine dress blues, faded and worn, and beside it a small case containing a medal. She opened it and read the inscription, Medal of Valor, awarded to Sergeant Cale Draven for extraordinary courage during the Siege of Proxima. She had heard of the Siege of Proxima. Most of the galaxy had. It was a human civil war fought on a colony world, a brutal years-long conflict that had shocked alien observers with its ferocity. The casualty reports alone had caused several species to reclassify humans from minor concern to potential galactic threat. She brought the medal to Cale, holding it up like an accusation. "You fought at Proxima," she said. Cale glanced at the medal and then looked away. "Yes," he said. "They say it was the most violent ground war in a century, that humans killed each other with a savagery that made the Kreth Wars look civilized." Cale was quiet for a long moment. "Yeah," he finally said. "Humans are good at killing. That is why you are still alive." He took the medal from her hand, put it back in the locker, and closed the lid. Salith watched him walk away. She did not know what to feel. While Salith pushed and probed and challenged, Alara watched. She was a xenolinguist, a scholar who had devoted her life to studying alien cultures. And humans had always been her particular fascination. At the Valith court, this was considered shameful, almost perverse. Why would a princess of the oldest civilization in the galaxy waste her time studying creatures who had only left their planet a few centuries ago? But Alara had always believed there was something extraordinary about humans, something the rest of the galaxy refused to see. And now she was living alongside one. She noticed everything. She noticed that Cale gave them the larger food portions and kept less for himself, even though his bigger human body clearly needed more fuel. She noticed that he adjusted the ship's temperature upward to better suit Valith biology, even though it made him sweat through his shirt. He changed the bandage on her arm. His rough hands moved with a gentleness that seemed impossible for someone his size. And she noticed the way he slept in the cargo bay, on a thin mat on the metal floor, curled against the cold, without a single complaint. On the third day, a warning alarm shattered the quiet. Cale was in the cockpit instantly, and the princesses followed. On the scanner display, 5 red marks were closing in fast. "Scythari Hunter-Killer Squadron," Cale said, his voice suddenly hard and sharp, in a way they had not heard before. "They are tracking your biosignatures. Strap in and hold on to something." What happened next changed the way both princesses understood humans forever. Cale flew the Iron Maw into a dense asteroid belt at full speed. The rocks tumbled and spun in every direction, some the size of buildings and some the size of mountains, and Cale wove between them with nothing but his own hands and his own eyes. There was no autopilot. There was no computer-assisted navigation. It was just a human being reacting faster than either princess had ever seen any creature react. His hands dancing across the controls, his body moving with the ship as if they were one thing. The asteroids screamed past the viewport, massive spinning death that missed them by meters. Alara gripped her seat so hard her silver knuckles turned white. Salith simply stared at the human, unable to look away. The Scythari ships followed them into the belt, but their computer-guided systems could not keep up with the chaos. One by one they fell behind. One struck an asteroid and exploded, and the rest pulled out, unwilling to risk further losses. Cale flew on for another 10 minutes, before finally clearing the belt and dropping to a slower speed. The cockpit was silent, except for the sound of heavy breathing. Alara was the first to speak. That? She whispered. Kale wiped sweat from his forehead and shrugged. Humans evolved running from things that wanted to eat us, he said. Old habits. Salix sat in her seat and looked at the human pilot, and for the first time since he had pulled her from that cage, she said nothing dismissive at all. They needed fuel, and they needed supplies, and most of all they needed information. And the only place to get all three in the fringe was a station called Ashenma. Ashenma was built into the hollow core of a dead moon, a sprawling maze of markets and docking bays and dark corridors where every kind of criminal and outcast in the galaxy came to do business. It was not a place for princesses. Kale stood at the airlock of the Iron Maw and handed each of them a hooded cloak made of rough brown fabric. "Put these on," he said. "Keep your hoods up and your markings covered. I have signal dampeners that will hide your biosignatures, but they will not hide your faces." He clipped a small device to each of their belts and activated them. "Stay close to me and do not talk to anyone. On this station, everyone is either buying or being sold." Salith pulled the hood over her head with a look of pure indignation. She was a princess of the most powerful dynasty in the galaxy, and she was being disguised like a common fugitive. But she said nothing, because somewhere in the last 3 days she had begun to trust the humans' judgment, even if she would never admit it out loud. They stepped onto Ashenma, and the princesses saw a side of the galaxy they had never known existed. The main market stretched for hundreds of meters under a vaulted ceiling of bare rock, lit by harsh industrial lights that cast everything in shades of orange and shadow. Vendors shouted in dozens of alien languages, selling weapons and drugs and stolen technology. Armed guards stood at every intersection, working for whoever paid them the most that week. And in the deeper sections, behind barriers and security checkpoints, were the slave pens. Alara stopped walking when she saw them. Rows of cages, some holding individual prisoners and some packed with groups. Beings from a dozen different species, sitting in their own filth, with dead eyes and broken spirits. A Sithari merchant was inspecting a group of small alien creatures, checking their teeth and their hands the way one might inspect livestock. Alara felt her stomach turn and her eyes burn with tears she fought to hold back. "Keep moving," Kale said quietly beside her, and there was something in his voice, a tightness, a controlled anger, that told her he hated this place as much as she did. Salith walked with her jaw clenched so hard the muscles in her neck stood out. She had known slavery existed on the fringe in theory, the way one knows about distant tragedies that do not touch one's own life. But seeing it with her own eyes was something entirely different. Kale led them through the market, to a quieter section, where a hunched alien with 4 arms and gray-mottled skin sat behind a desk covered in data screens. This was Vosk, an information broker who had survived on Ashenma for decades by knowing everything and trusting no one. "Draven," Vosk said, his wide, flat eyes blinking in recognition. "You look terrible." "I need information," Kale said, sitting down across from him. "And I need it fast." Vosk glanced at the 2 hooded figures behind Kale, and his nostrils flared slightly. He could smell that they were not human. But he was smart enough not to ask questions out loud. Kale transferred a payment, and Vosk began to talk. The picture he painted was worse than any of them had expected. The attack on the royal transport was planned and executed by the Pale Hand, the Sithari hegemony's most secretive intelligence branch. They had been planning it for years, waiting for the perfect moment to kidnap the princesses and frame humanity for the crime. The goal was simple and devastating: push the Valith Dominion into a war with the hegemony, while ensuring that humanity, blamed for the act that started it, would be crushed by both sides. "Dominion fleet is already mobilizing," Vosk said, "and there are Sithari agents spreading the story on every news channel in the galaxy. The savage humans killed the beloved princesses. It is a good story, simple and easy to believe, and most species already think humans are capable of exactly that kind of violence. "We need to get to the Dominion capital," Salith said from beneath her hood, unable to stay silent any longer. "If my father sees that we are alive, he will stop the war." Vosk looked at Kale with something close to pity. There is a Phalith loyalist admiral named Thalvor operating near the border. He is one of the few who might listen before shooting. But the route to him goes through Sithari-controlled space. "Of course it does," Kale said. He got the coordinates and stood to leave, but they never made it back to the ship without trouble. A group of alien slavers, 5 of them, big scaled creatures with weapons on their hips, had been watching the 2 hooded figures since they entered the market. They could not identify the species, but they could see the height, the build, the way they moved, and they knew valuable merchandise when they saw it. They made their move in a narrow corridor between the market and the docking bays. The biggest one stepped in front of Kale, while the others closed in from behind and the sides. "The 2 females," the slaver said, grinning with a mouthful of sharp teeth. "Hand them over, and you can walk away, human." Kale looked at him. "No," he said. The slaver laughed and reached for his weapon, and then Kale moved. What happened next lasted less than 30 seconds, but it changed something fundamental in how both princesses understood the word human. Kale hit the first slaver so hard, the creature's head snapped back, and he dropped like a stone. The second drew a blade, and Kale caught his arm, twisted it, until the joint broke with a snap. Wet crack, took the blade from his limp fingers, and drove it into the third slaver's shoulder. The fourth swung a heavy club, and caught Kale across the ribs, a blow that would have killed most alien species. And Kale staggered, grunted, and then grabbed the club and ripped it from the slaver's hands, before using it to put him on the ground. A 5th slaver grabbed Alara. Salith moved. The elder princess threw off her hood, and struck the slaver across the throat, with a precise blow that her royal combat trainers would have been proud of. The slaver released Alara, and stumbled. And Salith followed with 2 more strikes that dropped him. She stood over the fallen slaver, breathing hard, her silver skin glowing, and she looked across the corridor at Kale. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, and holding his cracked ribs with one hand, but he was still standing. They looked at each other, and something passed between them. Friendship, not yet, but the recognition of 2 fighters who had just stood back to back. "Move," Kale said, and they ran. They made it back to the Iron Maw, and Kale sealed the airlock and launched before anyone on the station could react. Once they were clear, and in open space, the tension finally broke. Kale sat in the medbay, a tiny closet with a basic medical kit, and tried to wrap his own ribs. Salith appeared in the doorway. She watched him struggle for a moment, and then she stepped forward and took the bandage from his hands, without a word. She wrapped his ribs with careful, efficient movements, and as she did, she saw the scars. They covered his torso like a map. Old burns, old cuts, old puncture wounds, layer upon layer of damage that had healed and been replaced by new damage. This body had been broken and rebuilt so many times, it was almost more scar than skin. "Why?" Salith asked quietly as she finished the wrapping. Kale looked up at her. "Why, what? Why did you not hand us over? Not just now, but from the very beginning. You could have sold us to anyone on that station for enough money to buy a new ship, a new life. Why risk yourself for 2 aliens who have treated you with nothing but contempt?" Kale was quiet for a moment. "Because someone should do the right thing," he said. "Might as well be me." Salith looked at him for a long time, and then she turned and walked back to where her sister was waiting. Alara looked at her with questioning eyes. "Perhaps," Salith said slowly, as if the words cost her something, "perhaps we misjudged his kind." The route through Sithari space was a death sentence, and all 3 of them knew it. The Sithari hegemony controlled this region with absolute authority. their sensor nets and patrol fleets covering every major transit corridor like a web of invisible wire. Any ship that entered without authorization was tracked, intercepted, and either boarded or destroyed. A lone human gunship carrying 2 kidnapped Valith princesses would not last 5 minutes on a standard approach. So Kale did not take a standard approach. He took the Iron Maw off every known flight path and into the spaces between, the dead zones, the radiation belts, the regions of unstable gravity around dying stars where no sane pilot would fly. For the first 2 days, they moved in short, careful jumps, dropping out of faster-than-light travel near dense objects that would scatter their engine signature, running silent with minimal power, creeping through enemy territory like a mouse through a house full of cats. The strain showed on all of them. Kale barely slept, catching minutes here and there in the pilot seat, his hands never far from the controls. Alara spent hours studying the Sithari patrol patterns on the scanner, using her scholar's mind to identify gaps and predict movements. Even Salith helped, standing watch in the cockpit while Kale rested, her sharp eyes monitoring the displays with the focus of a born commander. They were a crew now, whether any of them were ready to admit it or not. On the 3rd day, they hit the most dangerous stretch, a narrow corridor of space between 2 Sithari listening posts, where they would be completely exposed for approximately 40 minutes. Kale's plan was desperate. He shut down everything. The engines went silent, and the lights went dark, and the air recyclers stopped their quiet hum, and the Iron Maw became nothing more than a dead metal shape drifting through the void. Temperature began to drop almost immediately. "We drift through," Kale said in the darkness, his voice barely above a whisper, as if the Sithari patrols might somehow hear him across the vacuum of space. "No power, no heat, no emissions. We are just another piece of space junk." They sat in the cockpit, in complete darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of Salith and Ilara's bioluminescent markings. The cold crept in slowly, and then quickly, and Kale pulled a thermal blanket from a storage compartment and draped it around the 2 princesses without taking one for himself. They could see the Sithari patrol ships through the viewport, distant points of light moving in precise geometric patterns, deadly and beautiful in equal measure. No one spoke for a long time. Then Ilara broke the silence, her voice soft in the dark. "When I was young," she said, "I found a human music file in a data archive that had been captured from a trading vessel. It was a piece called Claire de Lune, played on an instrument called a piano." Kale turned his head slightly in the darkness. "I listened to it in secret," Alara continued, "because studying human culture was forbidden for someone of my status. But that music changed something in me. I had been taught that humans were brutal and primitive, creatures of violence with no capacity for beauty. And then I heard that music and I knew. I knew that any species that could create something so gentle and so sad and so perfect was not what we had been told." "That is what made you a xenolinguist?" Kale asked quietly. "That is what made me realize that everything I had been taught about other species might be wrong. It cost me my place at court, my reputation, the respect of everyone except Salith. But I would do it again." Salith reached over in the dark and took her sister's hand. "I was not always kind about it," Salith admitted, her voice carrying an unusual softness. "I mocked your fascination with humans. I called it foolish and beneath you. I was wrong." She paused. "I have spent my whole life being the strong one, the future queen, the one who never shows weakness. I was taught that certainty is strength and doubt is failure. But these past days I have felt more doubt than in my entire life, and I am beginning to think that doubt is not weakness at all." The dark made honesty easier, the way it always does. Kale stared out at the stars through the cold viewport. "You want to know about Proxima," he said, and it was not a question. Neither princess spoke, but their silence was an invitation. "My unit was called the Iron 16th, Kale said. 42 men and women, We had been together for 2 years, and they were the closest thing I had to family. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something held together by force of will alone. A refugee corridor. When we got hit by an armored assault, 3 times our numbers, heavy weapons, air support. We held for 11 hours. He stopped and took a breath. By the end there were 4 of us left, and then 3, and then 2. My best friend, a man named Torres, took a round through the chest. I carried him for 6 miles, through enemy fire, trying to reach the medical station. Another breath, slower this time. He died 200 meters from the door. The silence in the cockpit was absolute. They gave me a medal and called me a hero, and I could not stand it. I was not a hero. I was just the one who did not die. So I left. I took the first ship I could find, and I've been flying ever since. Alara's markings pulsed gently in the dark, a veiled expression of empathy and grief. You carry them with you, she said. Every day, Kale said simply. Salith said nothing, but in the darkness her hand found Kale's arm, and rested there for just a moment. The lightest touch, barely there, before she pulled it back. They cleared the listening posts without being detected, but their luck ran out at the Valith border. A ship was waiting for them, not a patrol vessel, but a pale-hand assassin craft, sleek and deadly, built specifically for hunting and killing. It had been positioned at the one point where a ship fleeing Sithari space would have to emerge, and when the Iron Maw dropped out of its drift and powered up its engines, the assassin ship was already moving. The battle was brutal and fast. The Iron Maw was a tough old ship, but it was a salvager, not a warship, and the Pale Hand craft was built to kill things much bigger and better armed. Energy bolts tore into the Iron Maw's hull, and Kale fought back with everything he had, firing the ship's 2 heavy guns, while trying to keep the damaged vessel from tearing itself apart. Section. Another took out the shield generator. P. Fires broke out in the engine room, and smoke began filling the corridors. P. Alarms screamed from every console, and the ship shuddered with each impact, like a living thing in pain. Kale made a decision that no alien pilot would have considered rational. He aimed the Iron Maw directly at the assassin ship and hit full thrust. The 2 vessels collided with a grinding crash of metal on metal, their hulls locking together in a tangle of torn plating and sparking conduits. "Stay here," Kale said to the princesses, and his voice had changed. It was hard and flat and empty of everything except purpose. He grabbed his sidearm and his combat knife, and he went through the airlock into the enemy ship alone. Alara found the ship's internal cameras. Most were damaged, but a few still worked, and she and Salith watched on a flickering screen as Kale fought his way through the Pale Hand vessel. Terrifying. He moved through the Sithari soldiers like a force of nature, close and brutal and relentless, taking wounds that should have stopped him, and refusing to fall. A blade cut across his shoulder, and he kept fighting. An energy bolt scorched his leg, and he kept moving. He fought the way humans have always fought when everything is on the line, with a desperate, ferocious refusal to die that had carried his species from prey animals on an African savanna to the stars. He found the Pale Hand commander in the ship's command center, and he killed him with his bare hands after the commander destroyed his knife with an energy weapon. Then, bleeding from a dozen wounds, he accessed the ship's databanks and downloaded the encrypted intelligence files, the proof of the entire conspiracy, every order, every communication, every piece of evidence that showed the Sithari had framed humanity. He stumbled back through the connected ships and collapsed in the Iron Maw's airlock. Alara and Salith dragged him to the medbay. He was barely conscious, his body torn and burned and bleeding, and the princesses worked together over him with the ship's crude human medical supplies. Supplies designed for a species that was somehow both incredibly fragile and impossibly durable. As they fought to keep him alive, Kale faded in and out of awareness. But every time his eyes opened, he tried to speak. Tried to give them the coordinates to Admiral Thalvor's fleet. 37 Mark 9, he mumbled through bloodied lips. Thalvor, the loyalist. Tell him we have the proof. Stop talking, Saywyth commanded, pressing a bandage against a wound that would not stop bleeding. You will not die, human. I forbid it. Kale looked up at her, and despite everything, the pain, the blood, the exhaustion, the corner of his mouth twitched in something that was almost a smile. Yes, princess, he whispered. Then his eyes closed. Alara ran to the cockpit. The Iron Maw was damaged, but it could still fly. And Kale had left his handwritten piloting manual taped to the console. Actual paper with actual handwriting, because of course the human used paper. She read it quickly, her xenolinguist brain absorbing the information, and she took the controls with shaking hands and pointed the broken ship toward the Valith border. She opened a comm channel on the frequency Vosk had given them and sent a single message into the void. This is Princess Alara of House Valara. We are alive. We have proof of the Sithari conspiracy. We need help. And then she waited, flying a dying ship through hostile space, with her wounded sister's hands covered in a human's blood. And she prayed to whatever power governed the universe, that someone was listening. The first sign of hope came as a wall of light. 12 Valith warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel in perfect formation around the Iron Maw, their crystal hulls shining with the deep blue radiance of charged weapon systems. Each ship was 10 times the size of the Iron Maw, elegant and deadly, and their arrival was so sudden and so overwhelming that Alara nearly collapsed with relief at the controls. The comm channel crackled to life. Unidentified human vessel. This is Admiral Thalvor of the Valith Second Fleet. You will power down your engines and prepare to be boarded. Any resistance will result in your immediate destruction. His voice was ice, controlled, suspicious, and carrying the absolute authority of a man who had spent decades commanding warships. Alara reached for the comm. Admiral Thalvor, this is Princess Alara of House Valara, second daughter of the Dominion. Hold your fire. There was a long silence on the channel. Other end. The kind of silence that happens when someone hears something impossible. The princesses are dead, Thalvor said finally. This is a Sithari trick. Then verify my voice print, Alara said. Verify my biosignature. I am transmitting both now, along with encrypted Pale Hand intelligence files that prove the Sithari orchestrated the attack on our transport and framed humanity for our murder. Another silence. Then footsteps behind her, and Saywyth was there, standing tall despite the exhaustion and the blood on her hands, Kale's blood, and she leaned toward the comm. Admiral Thalvor, she said, and her voice carried the full weight of royal command, the voice of a future queen that could not be faked or imitated. This is Princess Saywyth of House Valara, first daughter and heir to the Valith Dominion. You will stand down your weapons and escort us to the capital. That is not a request. The silence that followed was different. The silence of a military officer whose entire understanding of reality had just been overturned. Confirmed, Thalvor said at last, and his voice cracked slightly. Voice print and biosignature confirmed. Your Highnesses, you are alive. We are alive, Saywyth said, because of the human whose ship you are pointing your weapons at. He saved our lives at the cost of nearly losing his own, and he is dying in our medbay right now, so I suggest you send a medical team immediately. The Valith did not waste time after that. A medical shuttle docked with the Iron Maw within minutes, and a team of alien doctors rushed aboard. They found Kale unconscious on the medbay table, pale and still, his body wrapped in bloodied bandages, and they hesitated. They had never treated a human before. His species is resilient, Alara told them, pulling up human medical data on her personal device. More resilient than you expect. Treat the blood loss first. Burns. Then the fractures. His body will handle more than you think it can. The doctors worked, and Kale survived, because that is what humans do. The fleet escorted the Iron Maw to the Valith capital world, and when they arrived, the sight took even Kale's breath away. He was conscious by then, propped up in a Valith medical pod that hummed with healing energy, and he watched through the viewport as the planet filled the screen. It was a world of crystal and light, vast cities that rose like sculpted jewels from continents of silver forests, oceans that glowed with bioluminescent life, and orbital structures so graceful they looked like they had been grown rather than built. Everything humanity had ever built looked like a child's mud fort in comparison. "Beautiful," Kale said quietly. Alara stood beside him and smiled. "Wait until you see the throne room." The throne room of the Valith Dominion was the most magnificent space Kale had ever entered. It was a vast cathedral of living crystal that pulsed with soft cascading light, the walls rising hundreds of meters to a ceiling that opened to the sky. And every surface was carved with the history of a civilization that had endured for 10,000 years. Hundreds of courtiers filled the hall, tall silver-skinned Valith in elaborate robes and ceremonial armor, their bioluminescent markings glowing in complex patterns that signaled rank and lineage and emotion. And at the far end, on a throne that seemed to be made of captured starlight, sat the Emperor. He was old by Valith standards, his markings dimmed to a soft, steady glow, but his eyes were sharp, and his presence filled the room like gravity. The court had been expecting a spectacle, a primitive human dragged before the might of the Dominion, a curiosity to be examined and dismissed. What they got was something different. Kale walked into the throne room under his own power. Because he had refused the medical pod, and refused a hover chair, and refused every offer of assistance. He limped badly, and his wounds were still healing, and every step clearly cost him pain. But he walked. He wore the only formal clothes he owned, his old Earth Coalition Marine dress uniform, faded blue with silver trim, pressed and clean for the first time in years. It was simple and worn, and completely out of place among the crystal splendor of the Valith court. And yet there was a dignity in its simplicity that silenced the whispers of the courtiers as he passed. Salith and Alara walked beside him, not ahead of him, not behind him, but beside him, and that choice alone sent a message that every Valith in the room understood. He stopped before the throne, and he bowed, a deep, respectful bow, but he did not kneel. The Emperor studied him for a long moment. "So," the Emperor said, his voice resonating through the crystal hall, "you are the human." "I am," Kale said. "My daughters tell me you saved their lives, that you fought alone against Pale Hand operatives, flew through Sithari space with a damaged ship, and nearly died bringing them home. They tell me you did this without promise of payment or reward." "That is correct, Your Majesty." "Then tell me, Commander Draven, why would a human, a species with no alliance to us, no treaty, no obligation, why would you risk everything for two people you had never met?" The court was silent. Every eye was on the scarred human standing alone before the most powerful ruler in the galaxy. Kale thought about it for a moment, not because he did not know the answer, but because he wanted to say it right. "Because where I come from," he said, "you do not leave people in cages. I do not care what species they are." The words hung in the crystal air. They were simple words, plain and undecorated, and they struck the ancient court with more force than any speech or proclamation could have. The Emperor leaned back on his throne, and something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition, or the beginning of respect. Salith stepped forward. "Father," she said, and her voice carried through the hall with perfect clarity, "I must speak." The Emperor nodded. "For my entire life, I was taught that humans are lesser beings, savage deathworlders, who contribute nothing to the galaxy. I believed it without question, because it was easier to believe than to doubt. She turned to face the assembled court. I was wrong, and this court has been wrong, and this dominion has been wrong. A murmur ran through the crowd, but Salith silenced it with a look. This man gave us his only bed, and slept on a metal floor. He gave us the larger share of food, and ate less himself. He took wounds that would have killed most of the soldiers in this room, and he kept fighting. Not for money, not for glory, not for politics. He fought because it was right. Her voice rose. If that is what humanity is, if that is the truth we have been too proud and too blind to see, then we are not the superior civilization we claim to be. We are simply the older one. The silence that followed was the deepest silence Kale had ever heard. Then Alara stepped forward. I submit to the court my formal xenological testimony, she said, and her voice carried the careful precision of a scholar presenting her life's work. I have observed this human in conditions of extreme stress, danger, and deprivation, and what I have documented contradicts everything our culture teaches about the Terran species. She looked at Kale. Humans are not dangerous because they are violent. They are dangerous because they care. Their greatest evolutionary advantage is not their strength, or their adaptability, or their tolerance for pain. It is their capacity for empathy. Their ability to extend compassion beyond their own kind, even to those who despise them. That is what makes them extraordinary, and that is what saved our lives. The Emperor was quiet for a long time. Then he stood from his throne, something he had not done for a foreign visitor in living memory, and he descended the steps until he stood before Kale. Commander Draven, he said, the Valith Dominion owes you a debt that cannot easily be measured. Name your reward, a fortune, a title, lands, a warship, whatever you desire is yours. Kale looked at the Emperor. He looked at the Crystal Hall, and the hundreds of courtiers, and the shining alien world, visible through the open ceiling above. He looked at Salith and Alara standing beside him, watching him with eyes full of warmth. Then he said, I could use some fuel. The Iron Maw drinks a lot. The court stared at him in complete bewilderment, and then Alara laughed, a bright clear sound that echoed through the crystal cathedral. And Salith laughed too, a sound that surprised even herself, and even some of the courtiers could not help but smile at the absurdity and the humility of this strange scarred creature, who had saved their princesses and wanted nothing more than fuel for his ship. The Emperor smiled as well, a rare sight according to those who knew him. You shall have your fuel, Commander, he said, and more besides, whether you ask for it or not. In the days that followed, things changed quickly. The Pale Hand's encrypted files were decoded and distributed across every major communication network in the galaxy. The evidence was undeniable. The Sithari hegemony had orchestrated the kidnapping, framed humanity, and attempted to start a war through deception. The Dominion's war mobilization was halted. Diplomatic channels exploded with accusations and demands. Fractured, as moderates turned against the hardliners who had sanctioned the operation. And humanity, the species that had been dismissed as irrelevant and feared as savage, was suddenly seen in a new light. Kale was granted permanent diplomatic immunity across all Valith space, and was named an honorary guardian of the royal house, a title that had never been given to a non-Valith in 10,000 years of recorded history. Alara was appointed as the Dominion's first cultural ambassador to Earth, a new position created specifically for her, allowing her to pursue the work she had always dreamed of, building a bridge between two civilizations that had never truly spoken. A formal alliance between the Valith Dominion and the Earth Coalition was proposed for the first time, and no one in the court objected. On his last day on the capital world, Kale walked to the docking bay where the Iron Maw waited. The ship had been completely repaired, and quietly, upgraded by Valith engineers. The hull was stronger, the engines were faster, and the weapon systems had been enhanced in ways that Kale would spend weeks discovering. But it still looked like the Iron Maw, rough and angular and stubbornly human. Alara met him at the dock. "You could stay," she said. "There is a place for you here." "I know," Kale said, "but I have been running for a long time, and I think I need to keep flying for a while longer. Not away from something this time, just forward." Alara nodded and embraced him, a gesture she had learned from her study of human customs, and Kale returned it gently. "Thank you," she whispered, "for proving me right about your kind." Then Salith came. She walked toward him with the same regal bearing she had carried from the moment he first saw her in that cage, but something was different now. The coldness was gone, and in its place was something open and unguarded and real. "Draven," she said. "Princess Salith," he said. They stood looking at each other, and the air between them was heavy with everything that had happened and everything that would remain unspoken. "You are always welcome in the Dominion," she said. "Always. Not as a guest and not as a diplomat, but as a friend of this house and of its daughters." "I appreciate that," Kale said. Salith held his gaze for a moment longer, and then she did something that shocked every guard and attendant watching. She reached forward and placed her hand over his heart. A Valith gesture of deepest personal respect, reserved only for those who hold a permanent place in one's life. Kale placed his hand over hers. Then she stepped back, and he boarded his ship. The Iron Maw's engines hummed to life, and Kale settled into the pilot seat and began his pre-flight checks. And there on the seat, placed carefully where he would find it, was a small object wrapped in silk. He unwrapped it and found a Valith star compass, an ancient instrument of living crystal that pulsed with soft light, the kind of heirloom that royal families pass down through generations. Engraved on its surface, in elegant Valith script, were words he could read because Alara had been teaching him her language during the quiet moments of their journey. The inscription read, "For the shepherd who walked among wolves and did not become one." Kale held it in his scarred hands and looked at it for a long time. And then he smiled. A real smile. The first one in years. The kind that reaches the eyes and changes the whole face. And he set the compass on the console beside him. He lifted the Iron Maw off the landing pad and flew upward through the crystal spires of the alien capital, and out through the atmosphere, and into the vast, quiet dark of space. Below him, two princesses watched his ship become a point of light among the stars, and they carried with them the knowledge that the galaxy was bigger and stranger and more wonderful than they had ever been taught. And somewhere out in the black, a human warrior flew on, still scarred, still quiet, still alone, but no longer lost. The stars stretched out before him like an open road, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Kale Draven was not running from anything. He was heading somewhere, and that made all the difference.